Thank you for joining us. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you how state mandates have changed the New York counties over time. My name is Stephen Aquario, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Association of Counties. NYSAC has been in existence since 1925, serving county officials from across the state. I think it's important, before we talk about state mandates, what was the purpose of the government called the county in its original form? Well, there were many functions that were performed, but the ones that you're viewing at this point in time were the early forms of responsibilities. Of course, a fiscal officer, a treasurer was there, a county clerk, someone who was the official record keeper of deeds, transactions, licenses, and important documents had to be filed. That's why the county clerk is an extension and an officer or an agent of the court system to the modern day today. The sheriff, of course, going all the way back to the beginning of time here, coming from England, has a long and rich history here. The district attorney, the prosecutor, justice of the peace, judges, the judiciary, county court judge, coroners, superintendents of the poor, almshouses, or our nursing homes were a function of county government for hundreds of years. Child welfare programs existed, but likely now operated under this position of the superintendent of the poor. And finally, maintaining, building our infrastructure. Core purposes of the unit of government called the county. As we look at this slide here where we're talking about early state mandates, and a mandate being a directive or a law or a regulation from a higher level of government, in this case from the state of New York to the localities. Here we're seeing that even in the early 1800s, the state maintained a policy of regulating hours of work. The Wicks Law, as we all know it today, which is a construction law requiring multiple contractors. Instead of hiring one general contractor on a public works project, we have to hire multiple contractors in the 1929, the state adopting laws endorsing the state's responsibility for relief for state poor and the county welfare district's role, superseding town and city to administer income transfer payments or home relief, among other social insurance programs. Later codified in the state's constitution. I think it's interesting to note, right around this time in 1929, the state, for those of you viewing this, had imposed real estate taxes in the late 1920s, and in 1929 ceased levying property taxes in New York State and began its journey through a broader based system of income taxes, horse racing and gaming taxes, motor fuel taxes began to take shape in the 1920s, and property taxes remained under the jurisdiction of the local governments, with the state removing itself from levying property taxes. So our slide here talks about government efficiency in the 1930s. This slide here is informing the viewers that the state began in the 1930s to try to specialize local government. The state started to control service delivery, defining program parameters to ensure quality or consistency in outcomes, and trying to address duplication, waste of local services or local government operations. Interesting how the 1930s corresponds to the 2015 era, where the state of New York and its governor begins again addressing duplication of services, consolidation efforts at the local government level. Similar to the 1930s, the modern day governor in 2015 believes that state revenues going to local governments, this governor wants to be very careful that these state revenues that flow to local governments are not used in a wasteful or in a duplicative way amongst the local governments. Our next slide talks about, again, the specialization movement. The state began to define the county in the 1930s and the 1940s. This specialization requiring the government, the county, to administer now and fund welfare, social services, health programs, and while it was precluding the other units of government, towns, cities, and villages from providing the same service. Here we can see the state back in this era of the 1930s and 40s trying to address duplication, inefficiencies, local government operations, trying to control the behavior of the local governments. In other cases, counties, towns, villages, and cities were all allowed to provide certain services under state law. This is our general purpose function for local governments. That's why you see cities, towns, villages, and counties with a public safety function. That's why you see all of the units of local government having the same authority under waste disposal, landfills, parks, and infrastructure or transportation. In the final model, state authority was granted to create special purpose local districts, also designed to perform a single function. That's how school districts came into being: water districts, sewer districts, fire protection districts, lighting districts, library districts, and you know and can think of dozens more of the type of special districts that we now know in the modern day of 2015 and the forms of these districts that exist at the local government level. I think it's important to remember, though, that these districts were a direct result of state authority created under the jurisdiction of the state to begin to specialize at the level of local government to avoid waste and duplication of services. As we enter the decade of the 1950s, with it came an early mandated responsibility, later expanded into the 1970s, and that is in the area of community colleges. Our first community colleges came into existence in the 1950s, and again in the 1970s. State aid was set at 40% of operating costs. Interesting to note that that was later modified to up to 40%. And today, in 2015, the state statute requires 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. A third for the state, a third for the county, and a third for the student. Today's net operating cost of the community college system is approximately $12 billion annually, with only a state share of about $460 million, or 23%. The 1960s brought a relatively large expansion of mandates onto the New York counties. Persons in need of supervision, established in 1962. Medicaid, with a first-year county cost of about $20 million in 1966, rising to today's $7.5 billion of local taxes paying for this state program. Indigent defense was made a primary responsibility of the New York counties in the 1960s, and by 2013, the county cost of this program and its local taxpayers funding $360 million, 81% state, 81% paid for by the local taxpayers, with the state contribution of its responsibility of $59 million. Public assistance programs greatly expanded during the decade of the 1960s, with a share of 50% state and 50% county of the non-federal share. And just to give an illustration, in Westchester County, its share of home relief costs in 1960 was approximately $13 million. That grew by 800% by 1971, rising to $102 million. Safety net and home relief has gone from a 50-50 state-local share to a share of 29% state, 71% county in 2015. The 1970s brought with it labor law mandates, also known as the Taylor Law. Environmental control mandates. Costs were shifted to county health departments, requiring counties to pay large shares of capital infrastructure for wastewater and public drinking water. In the 1970s, the cost of this mandate rivaled the cost of welfare mandates. And interesting to note, in the 1970s, revenue sharing was enacted for all of the local governments. Counties, towns, cities, and villages collectively received 21% of the state personal income tax that was set aside for the local governments. The big 5 cities shared 10.5%, and all other local governments shared 10.5%. The 1980s brought with it early intervention mandates for the counties. Medicaid is expanded. The state does address the county's concerns for fiscal responsibility associated with about 10% of the local share of Medicaid in the 1980s, and assumes that 10% are long-term care expenses. But the local costs continue to grow. Probation. While counties had this responsibility long before, the state share of program funding was 53.5% in 1989. Today, that share is around 12%. And as we know, mandates within this program have expanded dramatically to the point where about half of a probation officer's time is spent meeting state-mandated requirements. The 1990s saw the expansion of preschool special education. State law requires a 75% state share in statute. That was never achieved. Permanent law today calls for a state share of 69.5%, and each year the legislature notwithstands this requirement, and they only provide 59.5% of the state share. This is a program that provides special education for 3 to 5-year-olds. Just to put things in perspective, in 2015, this notwithstanding clause cost the counties $171 million. What this is saying is the state really owes and had promised the counties $171 million that we are not receiving. Also in this year, at the same time preschool special education was created by the state removed the county's share outside of New York City in revenue sharing. In 2000, the state expanded pension program, and retirement fund returns that were driven by 2 recessions combined with the pension enhancements led to an increase of 1,700% in county retirement costs by 2014, increasing from $69 million to $1.2 billion. 2001, the state enacted the largest Medicaid expansion in the history of the program. County costs exploded. Property taxes soared in double-digit increases to support the rising state-mandated Medicaid costs. At the same time, more than 30 New York counties and New York City increased local sales taxes to keep their heads above water as this massive healthcare expansion rolled out. To address this property tax increase, the state implemented its first step in addressing Medicaid since the program's inception and capping the growth in it in 2006 by 3%. If we look at what was happening during the Great Recession, this 5-year or 4-year, 4 to 5 year period of time from 2008 through 2012, this Great Recession decimated local revenues and the state's economy. To combat this effort or to address this issue, the state reduces reimbursements to counties by nearly $400 million annually without reducing the cost of any of its state mandates. Most of these cuts are still in place today. The state share for local social service administration is eliminated. Child welfare, early intervention, safety net, Article 6 public health, community college aid, along with across-the-board 2% cuts to a wide variety of reimbursable programs were enacted. 2011, the state enacted its local property tax cap of 2% or inflation, whichever is lower, in an effort, again, very similar to the 1930s, to control local property tax growth. At this time, county Medicaid costs are also capped at 0% growth in 2015 to help the counties achieve this cap. However, between 2001 and 2014, state reimbursement to counties for its state-mandated programs dropped from 15.7% of county budgets to 10.3% of county budgets. This chart that we're showing you now looks at just 9 of the state's mandates. What are they? Medicaid, safety net, temporary assistance to needy families, child welfare, preschool special education, early intervention, indigent defense, probation, youth detention, and pensions, many of the mandates that we have talked about since the 1950s on this chart, showing, if you look to the far column, 99% of the county property tax levy outside of New York City, which is subject to a property tax cap, is currently consuming 99% of the county property tax levy just for these 9 programs. So addressing the costs of New York, government efficiency is good and should be pursued to the greatest extent possible at all levels of government. State government should consolidate, should become more efficient. Local government should be as efficient as possible always. But a larger and more important step is to begin to address the global budget and taxation in New York. We must review our total combined spending, state and local. What services we spend money on and why. Who's setting the rules? Which unit of government is the most efficient unit of government to fund these programs? What is the best way to finance all of these combined services? And finally, determine what is affordable and sustainable under the property tax cap that we have today. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation about unfunded mandates or mandates on county government, and encourage you to learn more about it. Please contact the New York State Association of Counties to learn more.